Σεβαστοί πατέρες, φίλες και φίλοι της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών, αγαπητέ πατέρα Brandon Gallagher, καλώς ήρθατε στην 8η και τελευταία συνάντηση του προγράμματος «Καιρός του Ποιήσε», ένα πρόγραμμα διαδικτυακών διαλέξεων της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών που σήμερα φτάνει στο τέλος του. Έχουμε την ιδιαίτερη τιμή και χαρά να φιλοξενούμε απόψε στο διαδικτυακό βήμα της Ακαδημίας τον αγαπητό πατέρα Brandon Gallagher, καθηγητή του Πανεπιστημίου του Exeter. Ο πατήρ Brandon Gallagher θα μιλήσει με θέμα πατήρ Γιώργος Florovsky και πατήρ Sergius Bulgakov, δύο συμπληρωματικές φωνές της σύγχρονης Ορθόδοξης Θεολογίας. Ο πατήρ Gallagher έχει μέχρι στιγμής δημοσιεύσει σε συνεργασία με τον Paul Ladouceur ένα πολύ σημαντικό τόμο ανθολογία με τα σημαντικότερα κείμενα του πατρός Γεωργίου Florovsky. Στη διδακτορική του διατριβή αναφέρθηκε εκτενώς στο έργο του πατρός Σεργίου Bulgakov και αναμένεται σε λίγο καιρό η έκδοση, η επιμέλεια ενός τόμου που έκανε σε συνεργασία με τον πατέρα Ιωάννη Χρυσαυγή για το θεολογικό έργο του πατρός Γεωργίου Florovsky. Έναν τόμο που προέρχεται από το πολύ σημαντικό συνέδριο που πριν 2 χρόνια έλαβε χώρα στο Οικουμενικό Πατριαρχείο στην Κωνσταντινούπολη. Είναι ιδιαίτερη χαρά και τιμή που φιλοξενούμε σήμερα τον πατέρα Gallagher. Έχουμε κατ' επανάληψη τόσο προσωπικά εγώ όσο και ως Ακαδημία Θεολογικών Σπουδών συνεργαστεί μαζί του. Και για να μην κρατήσω άλλο το λόγο γιατί περνάει η ώρα, θα παραχωρήσω το βήμα του συντονισμού στην αγαπητή Κατερίνα Πεκρίδου, γραμματέα Θεολογικού Διαλόγου, executive όπως λέμε Θεολογικού Διαλόγου στην Σύνοδο στη διάσκεψη των Ευρωπαϊκών Εκκλησιών, στην ΓΕΚ, και συνεργάτη της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών. Καλή μας επιτυχία.
Ευχαριστώ, Παντελή. Thank you so much, Pandelis, for giving me the floor and for having me here this evening. Reverend Fathers, dear participants to the webinar, it is my great pleasure to participate in the final online event in the series Time for Action, organized by the Volos Academy for Theological Studies. A warm welcome to all of you. Before we dive into our topic for this evening, I would like to remind participants of some housekeeping rules for our virtual meeting. First of all, you need to know that the lecture is being recorded and it will be uploaded soon on the YouTube channel of the Volos Academy. Second, please note that there is simultaneous translation in Greek, and to choose your language of preference, you can go to the little globe image, interpretation image, that appears at the bottom of your screen at the very right, and click on either Greek to hear the Greek translation or on English to listen to the original English lecture. I kindly ask our speaker and all of us intervening to the discussion to speak slowly and as clearly as possible, so that we facilitate our translator and colleague Paraskevi Arapoulou. Third, please note that all microphones and cameras will be switched off, except of the microphones and cameras of the panelists. If participants wish to intervene, I will give you the floor upon your request, and my colleagues providing technical assistance will allow you to access your camera and microphone. To raise a question, you can either raise the virtual hand, which you are able to see in the bottom at the center of your screen, or you may type your question in the chat box on your right, or alternatively, you could use the Q&A section again at the very bottom of your screen. I ask you to keep your questions or comments brief and to the point to allow time for our speaker to react. Moving on to the content of our webinar, this evening, as you already know, we will be discussing Sergius Bulgakov and George Florovsky, two complementary voices for contemporary Orthodox theology. We are truly honored and privileged to have Reverend Dr. Brandon Gallagher, Senior Lecturer of Systematic and Comparative Theology at the University of Exeter, to introduce the topic and help us explore the theological thoughts of two of the most influential Orthodox scholars and theologians of the mid-20th century. Why should contemporary Orthodox theology be equally attentive to the theological legacy of both these theologians? In this evening's lecture, Reverend Dr. Gallaher will show how Bulgakov and Florovsky, in their own distinctive ways, have played a significant role in determining the theological agenda of the 21st century. He will argue that despite their theological differences and the fact that they often are or presented at odds with one another, these two theologians actually had complementary theological projects, and he will lead us through an exploration of the common themes that concerned the two prominent figures. It is my great pleasure and privilege to introduce this evening's speaker, Reverend Dr. Brandon Gallagher, who is currently Senior Lecturer of Systematic and Comparative Theology at the University of Exeter in the United Kingdom. Previously, Dr. Gallagher was a postdoctoral and research fellow at the Universities of Oxford, Notre Dame in the USA, and Doshisha University at Kyoto, Japan. His publications include a volume on freedom and necessity in modern Trinitarian theology, published by Oxford University Press in 2016, the volume that was already mentioned by the director of the Academy, the patristic witness of Georges Florovsky, Essential Theological Writers, co-edited with Professor Ladouceur and published by T&T Clark Bloomsbury in 2019. And again, the volume which was mentioned at the very beginning, The Living Christ, the Theological Legacy of Georges Florovsky, co-edited with Reverend Dr. Chrysavies, and soon will be published by T&T Clark Bloomsbury in September 2021. Dr. Gallaher is currently working on a book project on Father Sergius Bulgakov's ecclesiology, eschatology, and ecumenism. He is a deacon of the Archdiocese of Thyatira in Great Britain and served as a theological subject expert at the Ecumenical Patriarchate's press office during the Holy and Great Council of the Orthodox Church convened at Crete in 2016. Dr. Gallaher, welcome. We are really eager to hear your presentation. I kindly remind you that you have 40 to 50 minutes, and I ask you to please speak slowly. The floor is yours.
Yes, I just wanted to thank the Volos Academy and Doctors Gallitsidis and Pekridou. It's a great honor. It is a wonderful opportunity for me to try to think through these two figures who have accompanied me in my journey for the last 25 or more years that I've been in the Orthodox Church. And so, yes, I will set out, and I'll be approximately 40 to 50 minutes. So, Father Sergey Bugakov, with his Sophiology or Theology of Holy Wisdom, and Father Florovsky, with his Neo-Patristic Synthesis, are what I would call twin colossi, striding modern Orthodox theology. Each of these men in their own way has set out the key themes and future challenges for the 21st century for the church and academic theology. Contemporary Orthodox theology must be attentive to both these men's theology and legacies equally. But this evaluation is far from uncontroversial. If Bulgakov is mentioned at all by many Orthodox scholars, other than as a heretic and in condemnation, it's often as the complete theological opposite of Florovsky, if not the enemy of Florovsky, representing a different theological universe entirely. This lecture will make the claim that Bulgakov and Florovsky, despite their very real theological differences, and I've dedicated a great deal of my life to expanding those differences, so I know they're real. Despite these differences, they actually had what I would say complementary theological projects, which can be appropriated for the purposes of helping Orthodoxy and Orthodox academic theology with the major challenges of the 21st century. And one of these major challenges is to respond positively, but critically to the West and the world more broadly, developing what I would call a future vision of modernity and secularism that is tailored to the tradition and history of the Orthodox Christian East. I call this vision an alternate Orthodox modernity and Orthodox secularity. And much of what I'm doing, of course, builds on the great work of Dr. Kalitsides in this regard. So it is an alternative to those...
Father Gallagher, I'm sorry to interrupt you. I would like to ask you to slow down a bit.
Okay. Those modern and secular visions on offer to the church in Western Europe and North America. Now, our theologians both affirmed common themes, which I will briefly sketch. First of all, a common creative and forward-looking understanding of tradition, sometimes called living tradition, with a reverence for the fathers, especially Gregory Palamas. Secondly, a vision of theology found at the bottom of a Eucharistic chalice, and an understanding of creation as being sacramental, as having, as Father Alexander Schmemann said, having divine roots. And then thirdly, a common emphasis on the imperative of ecumenism and outreach in Christ to the non-Orthodox. So Bulgakov and Florovsky expressed these different broad theological themes using quite different idioms. So these idioms are Sophia as a form of systematic theologizing and Neo-Patristic synthesis. And so they did this, these themes within quite different standpoints, with creation, either in the case of Bulgakov, being seen as in fundamental continuity with God, so-called Sophia, or in the case of Florovsky, creation asserted to be in radical discontinuity with its creator. And here I'm thinking of his teaching on creation out of nothing. So I argue that we are called to creatively interweave not only the common themes of both theologians, but to see that their two distinct visions, marked by their very different standpoints, are both, according to their context, equally necessary and can be drawn on according to need in the future of Orthodox theology after the Holy and Great Council of Crete, which I take to be a sort of dividing line between a new type of theology and an older type of approach. So there has been renewed interest in both theologians in the last 20 years, especially in Bulgakov. So first I will give a brief sketch of the teachings of these two thinkers. I won't get into their lives, and fill out what I mean by an alternate Orthodox modernity. Following this, I will show how the vision of the two men on different key themes comes together, and how it might not necessarily be at odds, and they could be complementary in our project. So first, Father Sergey Bugakov, 1871 to 1944. This theologian of the two theologians is far less well known in Greek-speaking circles. He was, as many know, a Russian theologian, philosopher, and economist. And he was a part of a generation of Russian intellectuals in the late 19th and early 20th century that returned to the church, often from atheism and Marxism, and formed one of the most creative movements of thought in modern Orthodoxy, what Nicholas Zernov called the Russian religious Renaissance. Now, Bulgakov was eventually exiled from Russia by the Bolsheviks, along with many of the most famous figures in the Russian religious Renaissance, figures like Nicholas Bergyaev, Simeon Frank, Nicholas and Vladimir Lossky, and indeed George Florovsky. And in 1925, he went to the newly formed St. Sergius Theological Institute in Paris, of which Pantelis, of course, Dr. Galitsides also attended, when he was where he was dean and professor of dogmatic theology until his death in 1944. Now, from the early 20th century, Bulgakov was inspired by the great Christian Orthodox philosophers, Vladimir Solovyov and Pavel Florensky, and he developed his sophiology, or teaching of holy wisdom. And this was articulated, because I'm assuming not everyone will be familiar with his writings, in many, many different publications, ranging from things like politics, philosophical theology, political economy, to systematic theology, biblical commentary. And indeed, the German edition, which is now being prepared by the University of Freiburg, is said to be in some 17 volumes. So this is quite amazing. So sophiology itself is very hard to explain, but I will briefly attempt to do so. So the basic idea, as I see it, is that God in himself, as Holy Trinity, Father, Son, and Holy Spirit, is an unending act of free, self-giving, self-emptying, and self-receiving love. This perfect act of free, self-emptying divine love, the love of love, as Bulgakov puts it, the act and the fact or substance of God as love, is what Bulgakov calls Sophia, or wisdom. But God as divine love is not content to remain in himself, to love only himself eternally as Holy Trinity. And so, in creating the world, Bulgakov argues, this divine love spills out and is expressed in and as the world. God creates an image of himself outside himself, in and as the world, which he loves as another other than himself. The world, which is like God in temporality and becoming, exists in perfect free love, just as God so exists freely and eternally. So Bulgakov expresses this vision by speaking of Sophia, of wisdom, in two forms, which form opposite sides of one total reality. He sometimes calls this an antinomy. So the divine Sophia as the eternal ousia, or substance of God, and the creaturely Sophia as temporal creation, as the divine act of love in and as the world. So divine wisdom, as the reality of existence, as the wise love of the Trinity, is expressed in everything in the heavens, from saints to angels, and then also in the earth, in economics, science, politics, art. Thus, Bulgakov emphasized that there is a fundamental continuity of love between the divine and the creaturely, at the same time as he emphasized that this continuity never wholly collapses the uncreated and the created, which remain in a tension. Now, Bulgakov's teaching was far from uncontroversial, and he was accused in the mid-1930s, when the Russian church was in schism, by multiple Russian rival churches of having teaching that was either alien to orthodoxy or heretical. And Vladimir Lovsky and Florovsky, of course, were opposed to his teachings. Now, sophiology of Bulgakov is a systematic Trinitarian account of all of reality in the light of Sophia, as the wise love of God for himself and for creation. It is an immensely world-affirming theology that tries to show how creation is tied by a golden thread to its creator. Thus, Bulgakov. Now, I will speak of Florovsky. Father George Florovsky is much better known in modern Orthodoxy, and especially in Greece, where his works were translated early on, and they are available in multiple editions. He was the teacher and or mentor of such well-known Orthodox figures as Fathers Boris Berbrynskoy, John Meyendorff, John Romanides, and Metropolitan John Zazoulis. And then he mentored other figures like Vladimir Lovsky, Saint Sophrony of Essex, Metropolitan Callistus Ware. His patristic vision of a return to the church fathers, liturgical worship, and traditions of hesychastic prayer as the wellspring of orthodoxy has continued until this day to inspire and guide the Orthodox. So his theology, which is called Neo-Patristic Synthesis, was developed in reaction to Bulgakov's sophiology. His key thing is that in 1948, he moved to become professor and dean at St. Vladimir's Seminary. In 1956, after acrimoniously being fired from St. Vladimir's, he moved to Harvard University, where he was to spend many years teaching patristics and Russian culture. His neo-patristic synthesis is sometimes called Christian Hellenism, or Hellenism under the sign of the cross. And he developed it in many seminal essays, which I've helped to edit with Paul Ladouceur, as well as his lectures on the Greek fathers. So I would argue that the signal dogmatic idea, that the key idea for Florovsky that you can find throughout his writings, is the fundamental discontinuity between God as creator, who is supremely free, and creation is that which was created out of nothing. Creation did not need to be created, Florovsky argues, and is held continually in being by God's grace. It is called to be free as God is free, and through God's grace can, through its striving, become divinized and exist in the same manner as God exists. His neo-patristic synthesis emphasizes the freedom of God and creation in Jesus Christ and his church, and so sees creation as another than God himself, totally different, but united to him in free love through Christ. Father Florovsky had a relative disinterest in cultural, ethical, and especially political matters. This is interesting because in recent decades, many people have drawn through the writings of his great student, Metropolitan John Zazoulis, and to have tried to apply his teaching to areas like politics. But he was relatively disinterested. Well, in fact, he decried and said he didn't want to get involved in politics. But he was especially involved in commentating on the fathers. And as I've said, he emphasized the discontinuity of God in creation. So now that I've laid out in a broad sketch these two thinkers, I want to say what I mean by an alternate Orthodox modernity. As you will remember, at the beginning, I said that this is the great thing that we need to work towards as Orthodox, to have our own vision of modernity. Now, I've articulated their life. I want to see how they might be able to sing together. So what do I mean by this alternate Orthodox modernity? First of all, Orthodoxy remains only partially modernized and partially secularized in the usual Western sense of the words. And this will depend very much where you look in the modern Orthodox world. Orthodox identity, arguably, is found within its pre-modern liturgical self-consciousness, its daily, weekly, and annual cycles of liturgical worship. The Byzantine Orthodox liturgical corpus, despite many things, has not radically changed since the early modern period. When I say, I'm not saying it's unchanging, but it hasn't changed as much, say, for example, as the Catholic liturgy has changed since then. And there is no central institutional or political mechanism to enforce liturgical revision. Now, when I say that Orthodoxy is partially modernized and partially secularizing, I am referring to quite concrete realities that most Orthodox can easily identify with. Firstly, the majority of the Orthodox in the world celebrate the church year on the old or Reformed Julian calendar. But at the same time, these same Orthodox Christians run their secular lives according to the new or civil Gregorian calendar. Or, to take another example, secondly, there's an expectation of Orthodoxy, a spiritual expectation, that its members will spend most of the year fasting from meat, fish, dairy, etc. However, the majority often will completely ignore this and only do fasting for a few days during Holy Week. Thirdly, the Orthodox hierarchical liturgy treats the principal celebrant or bishop as the living icon of Christ, using symbolic language in reference to Christ as the great high priest, and also drawn from Byzantine tradition, that of the emperor. Yet the average Orthodox assumes democratic values and would not accept the bishop as an absolute autocrat. So modernization and secularization in Orthodoxy does not follow a neat path. So sociologists of religion, such as Shmuel Eisenstadt, have long acknowledged that there is no one form of modernity. Others, like Jose Casanova, the sociologists, have said that there are multiple secularities. So multiple secularities, multiple modernities. Why would it not be possible then that Orthodoxy could be able to adapt its own form of secularity that would reflect its ethos and tradition, its liturgical consciousness, and its own form of modernity? However, very many different things have led in towards anti-modernism, anti-secularism, and anti-Westernism, which is one of the great themes of Dr. Kalitsidis. So in what we are suggesting, therefore, is that Orthodoxy, like other non-Western religions and cultures, can construct an alternate modernity and secularism, a new postmodern Orthodox identity that respects its Eastern pre-modern heritage, but is non-reactionary and in productive dialogue with Western modernity. This would be a vision that does not capitulate to the privatization and individualization of so much Western religion, and maintains Orthodoxy's distinctives, including a refusal to separate into distinct spheres, the secular and the sacred, a cosmic vision of creation in which Christ and the church elevate and transfigure all of society, as well as an aesthetical and sacramental ethos, but at the same time, being in dialogue with many things that we can learn from the West, including, for example, the tradition of human rights, the inviolability of the will of the individual and self-determination with equal opportunity for all, regardless of gender, respect for non-traditional sexual diversity, and allowing for religious and non-Orthodox visions that challenge and are in contradiction to Orthodoxy. So this is what I'm saying that we need to accomplish. But let's now turn to Bulgakov and Florovsky. I want to say that they have complementary visions and they can help us with this task. However, many would say this is just an impossible thing because Bulgakov and Florovsky are completely opposed. Firstly, there is a tendency to rather simply portray Bulgakov as a modernist and progressive, hostile to church tradition, and in contrast to argue that Florovsky was his complete opposite and was an ultra-traditionalist in opposition to Orthodox renovationism, as they call it. Secondly, there is a tendency to ideologize, hard to say, their different theological traditions and idioms. So you get some people who, for example, are against everything modern and Western, and they would say, oh, well, Florovsky is the one who helps us with this. Or other people who are in favor of various different more progressive stances, and they would hold up Bulgakov as their symbol, as their flag, and would say, oh, Florovsky is terrible. So I think that this is the wrong approach. So what I'm going to now do is to lay out 3 themes very briefly to show how they complement each other and how, in most cases, this could be applied to this theme of having a more positive vision of modernity and secularism. The first theme is tradition and the fathers. Now, above all things, Florovsky is well known for upholding tradition in theology. In a famous paper of 1936, Patristics in Modern Theology, given in Athens, he calls modern Orthodox theologians to return to their own Eastern tradition of the Fathers and the liturgy. The Fathers, he claimed, forged a canonized or new Christian Hellenism, such that their schemes and formulae were through and through Hellenistic or Greek. Hellenism, Florovsky concludes in some of the most famous words in modern Orthodox theology, is a standing category of Christian existence. A theologian must pass through spiritual Hellenization, he says. Let us be more Greek to be truly Catholic, to be truly Orthodox. Yet, in the very same paper, and this is often overlooked, Florovsky articulates a dynamic and creative understanding of tradition, what the Russians call living tradition, живое предание. And this is tradition not as the dead letter, something rooted to the exact statements of the fathers, but their spirit, their mind, their phronema. We return, Florovsky argues, not to the dead letter of patristic texts, but a return which is a rekindling of what he calls the creative fire of the fathers, to restore in ourselves, he says, the patristic spirit. And in a letter of 1963, he says that to his students, he says to his friend, that by no means must one accept what was situation conditioned in patristic teachings, and even affirming what was, as he says, inaccurate, inadequate, and wrong. For patristic authority, Florovsky argues, is not like the words of the Pope when he speaks ex cathedra. The fathers' authority comes from their visions and not necessarily their words. He says, this vision helps us face the problems of today. And we then must follow them, he says, creatively, but not in the mood of repetition. The fathers, for Florovsky, were witnesses to the Catholicity of the church, and we must turn to them because of their vision. Now, how does this speak to the need to articulate an alternate Orthodox modernity and secularism? It means that an Orthodox approach to tradition is certainly not directed to reproducing the verbatim teachings of the fathers in a slavish and repetitive manner, especially if those teachings were tightly bound up with the historical and conceptual particularities of an age which is long gone. The fathers are witnesses whose vision is of authority, as it speaks for the Catholicity of the church, and not necessarily each and every word they spoke, and which is recorded, must be followed. We must use our judgment. We must use our mind. Contrastingly, one cannot ignore, and one shouldn't, the Greek and Hellenistic particularity of the Orthodox tradition, jettisoning the cultural synthesis upon which they built. One must therefore reinterpret creatively the patristic vision and respond to the problems of the age. Florovsky was not, and I must say again, not an anti-modern thinker who advocated, for example, a return to absolute Orthodox monarchy, as sometimes one encounters with some ultra-traditionists. But he supported a robust democratic ethos, from what we can tell from his writings, with pluralism and diversity of opinions. Indeed, he opposed the romanticism of some of his conservative contemporaries that wished to return to the lost Russian Empire of the Tsar, which he is recorded as saying, he saw it as a dilapidated building that could not be restored. He said, instead, we must seek for Orthodox cultural revival. Too fast?
Too fast, Dr. Gallagher. Please slow down. Thank you.
I will do my best. But how did Bulgakov understand tradition? In fact, he taught an almost identical teaching to that of Florovsky, seeing tradition as spiritual rather than a historical principle. Indeed, Florovsky arguably drew his vision of tradition precisely from the writings of Bulgakov, as we can see in his Le Corps de Christ Vivant, the Body of the Living Christ, which now appears in an English translation in the new volume, which Dr. Kalitsides mentioned. And here is a quotation from that very work of Florovsky, a quotation of Bulgakov. He quotes, he says, as Father Bulgakov said, tradition is not a kind of archaeology. And he says again, first and foremost, this is Bulgakov quoted by Florovsky, first and foremost, tradition is to be understood as a living force, as the consciousness of a living organism, which includes its prior life. Tradition is uninterrupted and inexhaustible, Bulgakov says, quoted by Florovsky. It is not only the past, but also the present, in which the future already abides. So for Bulgakov and Florovsky, tradition is something that is looking to the future. Now, there is this view that somehow Bulgakov was uninterested in the fathers. Unfortunately, the English translations which exist, primarily done by Boris Yakim, encourages this view. I know from having been in communication with Boris Yakim that he actually edits out the patristic and historical aspects in these writings, the ones that he translates, particularly in his dogmatic writings, because he thought people would not be interested in them. So what you have then is a view, ironically, of Bulgakov as somebody which is totally uninterested in the fathers and wants to go beyond the fathers instead of being rooted in the fathers. But what we now know from the research in the last decade is that not only did figures in the Neo-Patristic Synthesis, like Florovsky and Losky, draw heavily upon philosophy and upon Romanticism, but figures like Florensky and Vladimir Solovyov and Bulgakov drew heavily upon the fathers. So Florensky and Bulgakov, for example, in their key period from 1910 to 1918, when they were developing their idea of sophiology, were reading Palamas and Maximus closely in dialogue. Bulgakov, as can be seen from his Greater and Lesser trilogies and his other writings, was drawing on a host of patristic sources, including St. Gregory Palamas, Leontius of Byzantium, Maximus the Confessor, Augustine, Gregory Nazianzen, and such heresiarchs as Apollinarius. Bulgakov repeatedly claimed in his late published work that Palamas was the source for his sophiology, and that the essence energies distinction was something that was wrapped up in sophiology. He claimed that patristic concepts could be adapted and in some cases consciously corrected. Here, he differs somewhat from Florovsky in that he did not fear, when he thought the fathers were doing something that he disagreed with, that one could adapt creatively and to do this. This led Father Matthew Baker, the late Father Matthew Baker, to describe Bulgakov himself as an unacknowledged exponent of neo-patristic synthesis. More recently, Marcus Plested, in a work which will soon come out, hopefully from Oxford University Press, called Wisdom in Christian Tradition, argues that Bulgakov simply cannot be understood without the patristic tradition, in which he read creatively, but also faithfully. So Bulgakov, somebody very similar to Florovsky in his approach. Bulgakov's approach to tradition, like Florovsky, puts the emphasis on the church in the present moment to creatively interpret the tradition of the fathers as witnesses in the present moment to the mind of the church according to need. Whereas Florovsky reminds us of the necessity of being faithful to the tradition of the fathers as a common heritage, whose historical context is not simply extraneous to its meaning, Bulgakov dares us to boldly reinterpret that tradition in new and unforeseen contexts, which may require exegetical elasticity, from everything to a greater understanding, I would argue, of the complexity of sexuality, to the advent of new technologies, which may transform our understandings of sacraments and community. So this is how I think they complement each other. Let us turn to the next theme, the Eucharist and creation and sacramentality. So it's almost a given for most that Orthodoxy is marked off by its focus on the Eucharist, and that the church lives and grows and defines itself by its liturgy and worship. Theology and spirituality are two sides of the same coin for the Orthodox. It should not be surprising then that Florovsky himself saw worship, and above all, communion and the Eucharist, as being the heart of both theology and the Christian life more generally. He argued that one, above all, sees Orthodoxy expressed in the services of the church, where we see, he says, the common mind of the worshiping church. One can best be initiated into the spirit of the fathers by attending the offices of the Eastern Church, he says. So in every celebration of the Eucharist, Florovsky says, we are given a manifestation of the mystery of the church, the common mind seen in tradition, as a living reality, which is the mystery, he says, of the whole Christ, gathering all into unity in all times and in all places. For Florovsky, it is actually in the moment of communion in the Eucharist where we encounter tradition in a concretized form. And therefore, we can be inspired in our worship where we encounter tradition to think liturgically, almost in light of liturgy, about contemporary problems of modernity and secularism. Thus, the church, I would argue, can only think through how it can construct an alternate modernity and an alternate Orthodox approach to the secular in harmony with the tradition of the church by thinking each problem in light of its reality as a worshiping community, binding together past and present and looking to the future. Thus, what we can learn from Florovsky's sacramental vision is that Orthodox ritual practice has not been isolated from global secularization processes, but the church develops its own post-secular responses by incorporating secular challenges into the performative arena of liturgy. Thus, I would argue, the Orthodox traditionally as a body bound together in one united mind and realized in unity in their worship can think through post-secular conflicts arising, say, from sexual diversity by discussing the application of sacramental economy in the sacramental acceptance of committed same-sex unions. This can be discussed, and tradition embodied in worship is the way that we do that. Or it can explore the demand for female voices in the church through debating the issue of the antiquity and revival of the female diaconate. I would argue that one can draw from Florovsky in doing this and his vision of what tradition is, which is embodied in the Eucharist. The Orthodox, in short, think and deliberate through worship. And this is only because in worship, as Florovsky has elaborated, tradition as the mind of the church becomes actualized. Now, Bugakov, what is missing in Florovsky's sacramental vision is any sense that the holiness of the church embodied in its worship in the Eucharist is a reality which spills out beyond the body and transfigures and renews creation. We see this very, very strongly, for example, in the writings of Father Alexander Schmemann, who talks about creation as a chalice of eternity. And Schmemann himself was mentored by Bulgakov. Father Boris Bobrinskoy, like Schmemann does in his writings, says of Bulgakov that, he, quote, theology ought to be drunk from the bottom of the Eucharistic chalice. This, Father Boris Bobrinskoy said, was Bulgakov's approach. In his last years, when Bugakov was dying from throat cancer, he would serve early morning liturgies, which Father Schmemann attended at St. Sergius with Matushka Schmemann. And I spoke to Matushka Schmemann when I was a student at St. Vladimir about these liturgies. We have an account by Schmemann of Bulgakov's serving the liturgy. And here he says, for the theology of Father Sergey, Father Alexander Schmemann said, is at its depths precisely and above all liturgical, and it's experienced, received in divine worship, an epiphany, he says. And he goes on and he says of Bulgakov's theology, the manifestation of God, but also of the world, such as God created it, of the divine roots of creation, destined to be filled with God, that God might be all and all. So this type of approach is to do with a sense that God's holiness bubbles up through the world is something that we can see very strongly in his writings. He has many writings on the Eucharist and on liturgy, Bulgakov, one of which will be coming out in an English translation in the autumn. Now, what I would argue is that his sacramental theology, given his sophiology, emphasizes the continuity of God with creation. So, in the case of Bulgakov, this notion can be very much applied to the contemporary difficulties with the environment. Because if God is, as it were, present in creation, if the chalice overflows into the world, then how much more must we say that to pollute the earth is a sin? And there is a Christological imperative that we honor the sacramentality of the world. Furthermore, Bulgakov also argues that economic activity involves transfiguring the world. Again, a sacramental approach to economics. Now, my last theme, and then I will summarize very quickly. Ecumenism and outreach. Florovsky, as some people will know, was the person who articulated the modern Orthodox approach to ecumenism. He argued, and he was very clear, that he believed the Orthodox Church is the true and only church. She does not witness, he says, to a local tradition of her own, but witnesses to patristic tradition, the common heritage of the Church universal. All other churches, he said, were called to return and be healed within the unity of the Orthodox Church. Not surprisingly, Florovsky saw the involvement of the Orthodox Church in ecumenism as a kind of missionary activity, or as the witness of the truth of orthodoxy to the Christian world. So his approach to outreach to other Christians is helpful for the Orthodox in their articulating an alternate modernity, as it both respects the uniqueness of orthodoxy, but requires that there also be simultaneously a witness to others of the truth, which is blessed, which the church is blessed to embody. And so we are called as the church to find points of contact with others in Christ. Now Bulgakov, and then I will summarize. Bulgakov likewise was involved in Christian ecumenism and outreach. Many do not know, but he indeed was one of the first people who was involved with the founding of the World Council of Churches, and he passed that on to Florovsky. He articulated what I would call a qualified exclusivism of orthodoxy by writing of seeds or grains of the Orthodox Church in non-Orthodox churches. Other non-Orthodox churches are Orthodox in some sense, he said, given not only scripture, common history, shared moral vision, and confession of the faith of the councils, but also because such Christian groups, through their Trinitarian baptism, contain a grain of orthodoxy, as he put it. So he argued that the invisible universal church, una sancta, orthodoxy as such, is like the ancient Jewish temple composed of two circles, and all baptized Christians belong to her and are, in a sense, Orthodox, even so far as they are Christian. In the inner circle of the temple, the Holy of Holies, is the visible empirical church, which coincides with the canonical family of churches known as Eastern Orthodoxy. But in the larger circle, the court of the temple, are the other Western Christian confessions and churches. These groups have to a greater or lesser degree a grain of orthodoxy, but they are all tacitly orthodox. The church then exists outside of the church. It exists outside of its walls, in the language of Bulgakov. But Bulgakov went further. And Florovsky was opposed to this. He advocated intercommunion between Orthodox and non-Orthodox Christians. He put forward proposals, about which I am now writing, for a limited, mutually episcopally blessed intercommunion between the Anglicans and the Orthodox in the fellowship of St. Alban and St. Sergius. So I'll just do my final thing and then my conclusion. Bulgakov's ecumenical approach simultaneously complements, well, it differs from Florovsky. While Florovsky emphasizes the discontinuity of orthodoxy in other churches and its uniqueness, but still says we must witness, Bulgakov typically focuses on the continuity of orthodoxy with other churches. His vision of other bodies, having grains of orthodoxy and seeing the churches as like the various courts of the temple, with the Holy of Holies being orthodoxy itself, is particularly efficacious in trying to emphasize both the uniqueness of the Orthodox Church, but how not only other Christians might share in and be in reference to the church, but going further, I would argue, into the other courts as you go out towards the outside, you might even see that other religions, such as Islam, exist in reference to Orthodox Christianity. Bulgakov's teaching on intercommunion has been widely condemned, but also, I would say, badly misunderstood. He was not denying the fact that orthodoxy was the fullness of the truth, but simply finding a canonical and sacramental way of actually affecting unity that went beyond the failed diplomatic notion of two churches talking themselves into unity. Talking does little. Hopefully my lecture will do a little bit more than the talking that he was against. Bulgakov's proposals are a witness to a creative attempt to conceive of a way to unify disparate bodies in the pluralism of the modern world, while still being faithful to Orthodox identity and tradition. Now, in conclusion, we are called to creatively interweave not only the common themes of both Florovsky and Bulgakov we have examined, but to see that their two distinct visions, marked by very different standpoints, according to their context, are equally necessary and can be drawn on according to need in the future of Orthodox theology after the Holy and Great Council of Crete. I've argued that Bulgakov and Florovsky share a broad common vision within which their disagreements can be reconciled. They are not ultimately theologically opposed. The church and tradition itself is big enough to include both their gifts and both their voices. They are the common patrimony of contemporary Orthodox theology. This lecture has tried to show that Bugak and Florovsky are not only, to adapt a British saying, singing from the same hymn sheet, but that their voices can be harmonized in the contemporary task of constructing a new Orthodox alternative modernity and secularism that remains faithful to tradition, yet creatively agile enough to respond to the contemporary challenges of our pluralistic world. But this harmonization is a contemporary labor and will not be completed, perhaps in my lifetime. And one must begin first with a better and more historically accurate understanding of what both men taught. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gallaher, for this stimulating presentation. We would definitely need more time to absorb all these different aspects that you have discussed. You have given us an impressive overview of the key theological concepts in Bulgakov and Florovsky's work in a very limited time indeed. And you have articulated quite clearly, I would say, your proposal for an alternative Orthodox modernity and secularism, while discussing the common themes of tradition and the role and significance of patristic writings in the work of the two theologians under discussion, as well as the Eucharist and its relation to creation and the question of sacramentality. And lastly, you have highlighted their views with regard to Orthodox participation in the ecumenical movement and interchurch relations. I'm sure there is plenty of questions concerning the complementary vision of the two theologians. For the moment, I see that Dr. Jean-Daniel Plus has raised his hand. So without further ado, I would like to proceed to the questions coming from our participants. Dr. Daniel Plus, you have the floor, please.
I have very much enjoyed listening to your presentation, Doctor. It was an unfortunate misstep for mine to raise a hand. I didn't intend to do so, so I pass on to other people who have questions to ask. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
It's nice to see you here anyway, Doctor. I will give some time to our participants to type their questions in the chat or in the Q&A section or raise their hands. I see already that Professor Ladouceur has raised his hand, so I will like to give the floor to him.
Thank you very much for the floor. Dr. Gallaher and I have been discussing these questions for at least a decade now. So this is a familiar ground for me, and I wish to thank him and congratulate him for his stimulating thought. During your presentation, Brandon, you spoke about Bulgakov's Sophiology, which is really the sticking point in terms of Orthodox theology. In your discussion on the three themes that you present as possible bridging points between Bulgakov and Florovsky, that is the approach to tradition, Eucharistic theology, and ecumenism, you did not mention Sophiology, as though these were somehow distinct from Bulgakov's Sophiology, and in effect pearls of wisdom which allow observers, at least those interested, to make the liaison, as you have done very effectively, between Bulgakov and Florovsky. So the question I have specifically, is it possible to consider elements of Bulgakov's theology apart from his Sophiology, and thereby build, as you said, an alternative Orthodox modernity? This is very much my approach, and the themes that you identified are themes that I identify as being possible to look at in Bulgakov. I would add a number of others, such as his universal ecclesiology, which these ones don't necessarily touch Florovsky as directly as the three that you've mentioned, though. Personalism in Bulgakov, even his panentheism, which you kind of indirectly alluded to in some of your discussion. Bulgakov's social and political theology, which again is a fairly weak area in Florovsky, and the notion of universal salvation, which of course Florovsky doesn't touch on at all. But to me, these are other areas in Bulgakov where it is possible to find the pearls of wisdom without becoming bogged down in the Sophiology. So the question is it possible to look at Bulgakov without getting freaked out by his Sophiology?
Well, as you're right, thank you, Paul. We've been discussing these things for a long time. I would say there's two approaches to this. One approach is the approach which I think that you are sympathetic to, and which I was sort of nudged towards when I was at seminary. When I was at seminary, at St. Vladimir's Seminary many moons ago, my teachers always thought it was incredibly bizarre that I was interested in Bulgakov. And Father John Erickson and Paul Meindorf. I remember that to the extent to which they were interested in Bulgakov, they said, well, why, what's the use of Sophiology? Can't we just kind of bracket it out and cherry pick, as it were, the best things? Now, is it possible to read Bulgakov in this way? Yes, of course. So we have his book on the Orthodox Church, which I think is maybe 1937 or something like that. And he doesn't make any reference to Sophiology there. There are other writings where it doesn't play any role whatsoever. So that is a possible way of approaching him. However, I would say it's a way which really doesn't take on his riches. If you really want to benefit from Bulgakov and to see what makes him different, you have to look at it in the full picture to be able to take the good and the bad of Sophiology. And one of the things that this vision of heaven and earth, as it were, in a sort of union gives us, is it gives a different vision of tradition. It allows us, for example, to see ecumenism as he indeed, as I'm arguing in my monograph, that he sees ecumenism as something which is a type of bringing together of the divine and the creaturely Sophia. That it isn't just something that is based on some particular thing that the Lord said, you be one as I am one. That the Lord said that because he wanted heaven and earth to come together, because they are made for each other in his will. They are made for each other in that creaturely love and heavenly love are made to be one. And it is only when the churches come together, and he understood this as an eschatological reality, it is only then that God will be all in all. He very much supported the vision of Vladimir Solovyov at the end of his Tale of the Antichrist, where the Christians would come together at the end. And indeed, sophiology was written into his ecumenism. And I would argue that Bulgakov is so much more interesting when we are not afraid about his sophiology and try to understand the insights that it gives us. Now, does it have problems? Absolutely, it has problems. And in fact, I spent a good part of the last 20 years examining those problems. One of my friends, my great colleague, David Bentley Hart, was very angry at me for precisely pointing out the difficulties of Bulgakov. And he said that I didn't understand the divine calculus, which Bulgakov understood perfectly, because I pointed out the difficulties with his pantheism. Now, I would certainly disagree with David because I think there are real problems. But I would agree with David in that I think Bulgakov is more interesting with his sophiology than with it not. We can learn more from him. And I think that he is a stronger theologian and he complements Florovsky better when we turn to that. So to give one more example, Florovsky has this, or Bulgakov has this notion that when one works in the world, one as it were, does particular labors. My labors involve writing or teaching my students. This is what he calls the Sophianizing of the world, which is his way of understanding transfiguring the world. You are contributing to bringing the divine and the creaturely Sophias together, which is a Eucharistic task. So work and economics must be understood in terms of sophiology. Now that's so much more interesting and so much more rich than simply a position that would actually bracket out his teachings. But I do understand people's difficulty with sophiology because I myself am a critic of it. But I've come to the point, I guess, in my life where I love my church, and I know that I must take even the dangerous things to help that church get forward and move forward on a whole host of issues, which I, as a deacon serving in the churches in England, see people struggle with all the time. And I think Bugak can help us if we use our sanctified common sense, as one of my friends said. So I hope that replies to you, Paul.
Thank you, Dr. Gallagher. I see that Dr. Kalaitzidis has raised his hand and would like to intervene.
Of course.
Thank you, dear Brandon, for this inspiring and stimulating lecture, yes, which opened actually many questions. I will limit it myself just to two. The first one, I come back to what you mentioned just before about the book by Bulgakov, L'Orthodoxie, the Orthodox Church. I think it appeared in 1932, if I'm not mistaken.
It appeared in first in French, I think.
Yeah, in French. Yeah. Yes. So it is true that in that book he didn't make any mention of sophiology. Yeah. So my question is, do you have any interpretation? Do you have any explanation about this? Was it in order to avoid any kind of debate or any kind of critiques, or yes, what is your explanation about this? And consequently, the fact that Bulgakov avoided to make any mention, any reference to sophiology in that book, does give us the right to say that maybe Bulgakov, he didn't need sophiology in order to complete his theological vision. This is the first one. And regarding political involvement, okay, it is clear that Bulgakov is much more involved in political discussions. He was elected deputy at the Russian Duma. He was for a kind of Christian socialism. He openly spoke about this. But I would say that, of course, Florovsky was much more conservative. From the late Matthew Baker, we know that he was a member of the American Republican Party. He had a membership card, a membership subscription.
Yeah, I mean, I think one needs to take that with a grain of salt, because in America, as I understand it, I'm not American despite my accent, you can sign and sort of check a box when you're registering, and then you can become a member. I don't think. Yeah.
Okay, my point is not there. My point is that Florovsky wrote an article, The Social Problem in Eastern Orthodox Church, which is, I would say, quite radical in social terms. He spoke for a kind of Christian socialism. He didn't use this term, but the content of the article, the content of the paper refers to a kind of Christian socialism. How do you see this? And just a final word. In your lecture, I think that you criticize the conservative Orthodox who attack Bulgakov for his sophiology. But I felt that you disagree also with contemporary scholars who focus and who put the emphasis on the on the radical difference between Florovsky and Florovsky and Bulgakov. I guess that you don't agree with, for example, Arzakovsky or with Gallaher in their analysis.
Thank you, Pantelis. Well, first of all, in regard to that book, as I understand it, and he did write that book, and particularly because it was in a very difficult period where he was being attacked for his teachings. And he wanted to be able to set out something that was for an ecumenical audience without bringing in what many people were telling him was a stumbling block. Now, Bugakov wrote many, many, many works, far more than Florovsky, and a great portion of them from certainly from the late 20s onwards have sophiology in them in some fashion. So just because he was able to give a sort of general introduction, a creative introduction to the whole idea of his teaching without mentioning sophiology, doesn't mean is that you can't understand it in its richness much better if you turn to sophiology. And what I would argue with him is that very often he will, very often there's points in his teaching where he will set out ideas without sophiology, but in the background tacitly, and you will find this in his other writings, you will see a sophiological actually kind of spin. So as it were, sophiology is being stated in other terms. I think it's much better to just gain the benefit of trying to wrestle with the difficult notion of sophiology and gain, as it were, the full picture. Now, the second thing, am I critical of, I'm very much respectful of Professor Gallaher and with Antoine, who is a friend of mine, but I disagree with them. I also disagree with one of my old friends. Well, he may have changed his mind on this, but Father Michael Plekon was more of Antoine Arzakovsky and Gallaher in seeing them, which is to say Florovsky and Bugakov, as being sort of utterly opposed. So my work at the moment, after having first spent many, many years working on Bugakov and then many on Florovsky, is to say that, sure, there are some very big differences between the two, but actually, as you've pointed out about that one essay, they actually complement each other. And I think it's possible, entirely possible, as we see with the icon of Peter and Paul. Peter and Paul is coming up, that two people who would seem to be opposed can be brought together in the mind of the church, and we can use each of them, their gifts, in different ways. So this is what I am proposing, that first of all, we need a much better historical understanding of these two figures. And I've spent a lot of my career so far doing that. And then upon that historical basis, which I think a lot of that work has happened in the last 20, 30 years, we then need to say, well, sure, they differed, but it doesn't mean that they can't help us with contemporary kind of things, and each give us different insights. So that's what I'm trying to say. You can differ, but you can still agree on the broad issues. And I think that that is what Bulgakov and Florovsky have. They agree on the broad issues, and they can help us together. Instead of trying to create sort of ideological camps, the camp of Bulgakov in a lot of the English and sometimes French-speaking world would be that of the progressives, the modernists. And then the camp of Florovsky would be, in a lot of the Orthodox world, yourself probably excluded, Pantelis, would be understood as the conservatives. I think that this is a misunderstanding, and it makes theology dull, and it doesn't help us. So I hope that responds to what you're saying. I think, did they have very different idioms? Is sophiology, saying something different about, in terms of its emphasizing continuity between what Florovsky said about the absolute difference in terms, yes, sure. But it doesn't mean that we can't see the truth in both positions and bring them together in a sort of synthesis. And that's what I hope to do. So in an antinomy, as it were, to learn from Bugakov in that regard. I hope that answers your questions.
Thank you, Brandon. Thank you very much.
I see that Professor Vassiliadis has asked the floor, but he says that he wants to shift the conversation. So for the moment, I will turn to the Q&A section. There is a question there about Bulgakov. What are the best translations of Bulgakov that include all the references to the fathers and the Orthodox tradition that are missing in those you mentioned? And I remind us that we need to speak slowly, please.
Okay. Unfortunately, so that the translations that have recently been done by Professor T. Alan Smith at the University of Toronto are highly impressive, and I would say a model of translation. In his translation of Sviet Nevecherny, Unfading Light, he even corrects Bulgakov's references when Bulgakov gets his references wrong. They're that good. So he is not an abridged Bulgakov. However, and they're also accurate, I might add. The ones of Yakim, Yakim is faithful when he translates Bulgakov, but unfortunately, they're almost always abridged. The worst version is Nevesta Agnetsa, the Bride of the Lamb, which is just a fragment of the original, which was published posthumously. Now, the French translations by Konstantin Andronikov, these are more faithful. So if you read French, they will include a lot of most of the references, but in some cases they don't. They will be stuff missing. And so you have to go to the Russian original. The recent German translations that are now coming out from Freiburg, probably they would be, along with T. Alan Smith, the best. These are by Regula Svalin, and she's working with Barbara Hallensleben on this work and others, and these are very good. So there is now a large translation project that is fronted by two people, Paul Ledouceur and Michael Miller. And that is going to most likely appear from T&T Clark, Bloomsbury, and that will include basically most of what theologically has not appeared up until now, and they are complete translations. So really, it's going to be another, I would say, another decade. And what we need in English is, and perhaps in French, but I doubt that will happen, it's already happening in German, is we need accurate translations of the major works that do not remove all the biblical exegesis, because he wrote a lot of biblical. So people will know that recently there was a translation of what's regarded as the sort of appendix to the great or major trilogy, that is an ad literam, a sort of line-by-line commentary on the Apocalypse, on the Book of Revelation. But he also wrote commentaries on the epistles in the Gospel of John. He was in that sense, as Meyendorff said, a sort of contemporary origin in both senses of the word. So I hope that answers what you're saying. It will be a task for future scholars. And there are a lot of young scholars who are working, such as Harry Moore of Oxford, Michael Miller, and others, and they are working to translate and provide good translations. T. Allen Smith wrote me the other day, and his translation of Bugakov's work on the philosophy of language, because he wrote on that too, called The Philosophy of the Name. That is coming out from Northern Illinois Press, I think, something like that. So he's done a translation of that and many other works as well. So I hope that answers the question.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gallaher. On the chat, there's also a question from Dr. Asproulis. I guess that relates to the previous conversation we had. Can you say that Florovsky's and Bulgakov's theologies are a two-step theology, beginning with Florovsky and continuing with Bulgakov? And here he refers to Vallier's church dogmatics and church and world dogmatics model.
I'm not exactly sure what he means by a two-step thing. Yeah, I'm not clear what he means. I know that Valliere has said this. I guess, yeah, I would have to know what Nikos is actually saying.
I'm wondering if Nikos would like to unmute himself and explain. Maybe our colleagues can help us. Valila, and could you please give the floor to Nikos Asproulis? It seems there must be a difficulty there, so... okay, here is Nikos.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, indeed, yeah, can hear you.
Hello, my friend.
Hello, yes, thank you.
Nice to meet you, even virtually.
Yes,
so
indeed.
The question has to do with, let's say, a two-step theology, meaning that we can begin with Florovsky's more, let's say, ecclesiastical theology, dealing with more traditional topics, founded in more, let's say, doctrinal themes, and continue with Bulgakov, which is his theology is more open to secular issues.
Yes, I mean, that would be my, if that's what you mean, well, that's my own approach. I didn't realize I was doing what Valliere is indicating.
No, Valliere uses these two models, church dogmatics, with which related more to Florovsky, and church and world dogmatics, which related more to Bulgakov.
Yeah, I mean,
it's a closer, let's say, model.
Yes, I think that Florovsky, and here I would agree with Pantelis, that actually Florovsky already has the world dogmatics, if you want to call it that, the engagement, or at least has the potential for that engagement in his work. One just needs to look for it. His understanding of tradition, for example, is basically identical with Bulgakov. Where he would differ from Bulgakov is that he was much more wary of being able to abstract Orthodox teaching from the language and concepts of what he would have called Christian Hellenism. And he criticized Bulgakov for such. So I would say both of the thinkers have this two-step, but in Bulgakov it's much clearer. And one of the reasons that it is clearer is partially because of issues to do with biography. So Bulgakov started as a political economist and then came to theology later. Florovsky, well, he was trained as an historian of philosophy, and he almost had a sort of, I think this is related to his biography, a sort of nervousness about kind of contemporary ethical and political issues. And so it's very rare that you get him commenting. You need to, as it were, fill in the blanks. Some Orthodox theologians, and this certainly wouldn't be Pantelis, but some venerable and great Orthodox theologians have, in a way, gone in a wrong direction, I think, with Florovsky's theology, in that they have tried to act like the ethical and the political is something that we should be uninterested in. And that in fact, Florovsky's teaching, and he does teach this, that we, as it were, are called to exist and to exist as freely as God exists freely, that this is somehow some sort of, as it were, escape from nature and from the context of the world, and that to go from nature, which shouldn't be a necessity, and to go out to other persons means that we don't get bound up with definitive kind of ethical and political positions. And we should avoid doing that. And that is a Western misunderstanding and a type of essentialism, which is against personalism. This is certainly a legitimate interpretation of Florovsky, but I would say it is a limited one. And I'd say that it doesn't help us at all in our present position. We need more daring positions. In the last 15 years, Professor Papanikolaou and Professor Kalitsidis have led with these daring interpretations. But I think now we need actively to do what Dr. Esproulis and Dr. Ladouceur and others are doing, which is to draw actively on other figures who were precisely engaging with politics and ethics. So for example, the writings of Simeon Frank, amazing thinker, a thinker who has, I suppose, ontologically much more in common with Bulgakov. He was a type of Christian Platonist, but he was, I mean, his writings are so rich in helping the Orthodox respond to contemporary ethical and political issues. Fortunately, some of the translations are now coming out in new, you know, the ones that are out of print are coming out. So I think that one of the things that we need to do to avoid the mistakes is to understand that there are difficulties with these thinkers, you know, with Simeon Frank and with Bulgakov. There are difficulties that one must continually struggle with a type of incipient pantheism. And I've written about this at great length, but it is also possible to learn from them still and draw from them. So that's what I hope Orthodox theology will do, and to do the sort of work that you, Nikos, are doing.
Thank you, Brandon.
Thank you, Dr. Gallaher. I would like us now to turn to a question from Fadi Nasser. Thank you for such an informative presentation. And if I may ask about, and excuse my far-fetched question, consumerism and the post-pandemic effects of the church congregation and modality, how can they be approached by this harmonization that can lead the Orthodox Church in finding its voice?
In regard to consumerism, well, a critique of, if consumerism is a part of the whole neoliberal kind of approach, which commodifies everything in reality, which reduces everyone to, atomizes the individual, absolutely, Bulgakov would be helpful in this regard. He was somebody that was highly critical of any type of economic approach that you know, would atomize individuals and would as it were, cut them off from creation and from their brothers and sisters in a community. So I think that we can learn from him in his understanding of community, in his understanding of economics. So for example, he had a sacramental approach to work. This is where his sophiology is really, really useful. He understood that when we are doing work, when we're involved in politics, that this is part of our, you know, kind of upholding of creation for its transfiguration. This is part of our work as priests of creation. And in this type of thing, all spheres can help. Including, look at what's happening now with us. Here we are from multiple countries, and we are being bound together in a work together where we're exchanging ideas through this new technology. Even though I prefer in-person worship to Zoom worship, many people who were locked up and they couldn't get away because they were sheltering during this time, they were able to appreciate worship. One of my good friends told me this morning that he was able to, you know, he wasn't able to get out to liturgy. And so he was able to attend liturgy through Zoom in France, because he's friends with the French community. And so this is a part of this way that technology can be transformative. It's a part of our Sophianization of the world, I would argue. Our participation in, as one of my teachers, Paul Fittis, recently said in a thing, it's a participation in the type of relationships of the Holy Trinity. So this is where I think the sort of theology of can we look to a more, you know, a more positive vision of technology and of society, and we can bring our Orthodox Eucharistic and sacramental vision and see the things that we are engaged in as positive, and have less of this approach where, you know, all the things of the world are evil and it's only the nice things which are in and around the altar which are holy. We are a church which puts the holiness of the Spirit in everything. As Yates says, everything we look upon is blessed. God is in all things. O heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, who art everywhere present and filling all things, treasury of blessings and giver of life, come abide in us. That is the sort of theology which is an alternate version of modernity and secularism, where the secular and the sacred interweave, and people are brought together through economic relations and through technology.
Thank you so much. I see that Professor Vassiliadis and also Professor Kesareas from Erfurt have raised their hand for some time now. So I would like to give the floor first to Professor Vassiliadis and then to Professor Kesareas. And I ask them to speak slowly so that we are able to interpret. Professor Vassiliadis, please unmute yourself. Thank you. Professor Vassiliadis, can you hear us? Can you please unmute yourself?
Am I now
yes,
unmuted? Okay.
Thank you.
I would like to express my sincere gratitude to my dear friend Brandon.
Thank you,
not
Professor.
only for some references he made, one of which, as you may realize, is about the restoration of deaconesses.
I was thinking of your book, Professor.
After all, you are a deacon, and the diaconate is a much forgotten element in our Orthodox tradition. I didn't want to intervene at the beginning because I wanted to listen to your arguments. Some of them were also hinted in your primary presentation, and others were also hinted by the questions by Pantelis, by Nikos, and the other questions. Because I admire your general project, not just your presentation today. The general project of rehabilitation of Bulgakov is extremely helpful for the future of our Orthodox theology. You mentioned many dimensions in our ecclesiastical life, but I am a little bit skeptical about the importance we all have placed, and we are still placing, on the Neo-Patristic paradigm. Of course, it was the paradigm that won the case, the game, the war, and that is why we need the rehabilitation of Bulgakov, as we need the rehabilitation of other Russian theologians. I am referring to Nikolai Berdyaev, and I would like to mention here that Berdyaev's works were first translated before even Florovsky's and the others from very early in the 50s, if I remember well, by Metropolitan Irenei of Samos. So we need this kind of rehabilitation. However, I wonder whether it is important still to revolve around the so-called patristic, the so-called Hellen or Greek fathers, about the so-called neo-patristic paradigm or narrative, if I may say so. Coming from a biblical tradition, we have, of course, respected all the work by Florovsky, even by Losky and Bulgakov. But at the same time, we were very skeptical whether this kind of returning back to our so-called Greek patristic tradition and forgetting the primary prophetic element of the biblical tradition, not to mention that eschatology and pneumatology have rediscovered by biblical theologians first. So I would like another paradigm to be together with the neo-patristic, as you try to combine, I mean, Bulgakov and Florovsky. I wonder whether we should make this prophetic, missionary oriented. And as you know that in our Greek tradition, Greek theological tradition, most theologians are not so much known if they depart from the so-called Florovskian paradigm. Yanulatos, for instance, his contribution, or the other, the Romanian, the missiologist, not to mention my Dr. Father, Professor Agouridis, who in a way was in the sense, in the spirit of Bulgakov and Berdyaev rather than of Florovsky, although they have promoted, I mean, he has promoted the works of, at least in publishing and translating into Greek. So is it the time ripe that we go beyond this neo-patristic Florovskian paradigm back to a more prophetic, and here by prophetic you can understand that also political and all the other dimensions are related, but more prophetic, more Christological, more biblical. And
well, yes.
Alamite centered. Even you try to explain and to give some reasons that they both, Florovsky and Sergey Bulgakov, admired. We all admired this kind of, I would say, great theologian in the Palamite circle. But is it true that the failure of the Holy and Great Council was in a way because the connection, despite the explanation given by by Florovsky and the others about this paradigm, we remained, I would say, traditionalists, conservatives, and this will prevent your goal, your vision to a modernizing Orthodox theology. Sorry for speaking.
Thank you, Professor.
Well, I mean, Professor, I'm a great admirer. And in fact, when I was mentioning the work on deaconesses, I was actually thinking of your book visually in my mind. And there have been many people who have been pointing to what you call this prophetic or scriptural or biblical. I mean, all the work of John Behr in the last decade has, for example, Father John Behr has pointed in that direction. And one of the things that is most interesting about Bulgakov, and well, it also exists in Florovsky, but Bulgakov in particular was a commenter on scripture. It was years ago when I met Father Andrew Louth. Actually, it was for Father John Behr's ordination, and he pointed out to me, this was probably 20 years ago or something like this, that that one of the ways that Bulgakov's whole theology was structured was exegetically. So I think these things can complement one another. The fathers were significant because they were exegetes, because they wanted to take from this prophetic tradition. And another person who can help us here is Vladimir Solovyov. Most of his writings still remain untranslated. And prophecy was absolutely at the heart of everything that Solovyov wrote about. And indeed, it's said that when he died, he was saying the Psalms in Hebrew to himself. So it is possible, we've tended to see everything in this atomized way. What we need is a synthetic approach. And this synthetic approach will be one missio that is sent out into the world to meet the world and affirm the world, where that world shows us the face of Christ. And so this not only will be drawing on our biblical tradition, but it will be drawing on the best of what exists in secular, kind of contexts. It will be drawing on world religions where they can help us. Now, does this mean that, there are plenty of things in the secular world that you know, that somehow everything in the world is wonderful. I'm not saying that. One must use your sanctified common sense, your critical reason. And this is where in the church, through our prayer and through our worship, we think through these issues. We encounter the challenges, the post-secular challenges, the post-secular conflicts, and we see how tradition and wisdom helps us deal with these things. So too, we need to apply these to all areas. And so, yes, I am absolutely on the same page as you. What I want to do, though, is I don't think that some approaches where people just say, oh, this neo-patristic stuff, let's just forget about that, is very helpful. I'm a pragmatic person. I think that if you are to go forward, you have to bring the whole church with you. And that means building on what exists and in a type of synthesis going forward. So that's why I'm trying to bring these two figures together so that we can go forward in this prophetic missiological way. So, yes.
Thank you. I'm grateful.
Thank you so much, Professor and Dr. Gallagher. I would like to give the floor to Professor Evstathios Kesareas now. Thank you.
Can you hear me?
Yes, indeed. Yes, thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much, Dr. Gallaher. Before I pose my question, just a correction. I'm not a professor. I'm a postdoctoral researcher. If I understand well, the proposal, the vision for an alternate Orthodox modernity does not just aim to offer a middle ground solution between the traditionalists and secularists, but more importantly, to constitute a dynamic intervention within the existing world. So my question is, could this proposal in the end result into a totally new version of Orthodoxy? Does it leave open this possibility? And okay, I know you are not a prophet, but how do you react to such a possibility? Thank you very much.
Well, thank you. And I'm aware that you, I think you work with Professor Pekridou, who has helped me a lot through his writings. So I am, I think Orthodoxy understands the Holy Spirit is a spirit of surprises. And there are things that we cannot foresee. Now, does this mean that there will be some sort of total break with what went before? I don't think so, because then how would you have the same identity? How would you be able to talk about continuity of mind and spirit? But there may be things and there may be elements in what now exists in some teachings that are not at the core of what it is that we hold as Orthodox. One of the benefits, I think, of our Orthodox tradition, and maybe this is providential, is unlike the Catholics, we have not been able to hold everything into unity. And so we haven't been able to dogmatize as much on many issues. There are comparatively small number of things where you have a sort of conciliar backing. And if you look at the Holy and Great Council of Crete, well, a lot of the time it just sort of described stuff. It didn't come out with positions. And at first I was frustrated by this because I thought, well, you know, think of all the different unresolved issues in Orthodoxy. And I'm not just thinking of contemporary kind of post-secular conflicts like to do with LGBTQ plus stuff, but I'm thinking of practical things like fasting. How do we deal with fasting when the fasting rules were created? And I think actually now, what we must see is that this is providential. That perhaps in Orthodoxy of the future, there will be more diversity of different teachings dependent upon the context without allowing for some sort of contradiction. So for example, maybe some people will disagree with me, but there are some Orthodox churches which allow the use of contraception as long as it is not abortifacient. Others who, as I believe perhaps the Russian church holds this position, certainly Metropolitan Hilarion seems to think, you know, equate it with abortion. So perhaps there will be more circumstances like that, and we will have an orthodoxy actually much more diverse, but still held together. This is a sort of orthodoxy which I think must live with the reality of pluralism as a gift that we can learn from, but also a challenge, because we don't want to throw the baby out with the bathwater.
Thank you so much. Thank you both. I would like to move to a question asked in the Q&A section by Christopher Savage. Thank you for a very stimulating presentation. Is it possible to understand Bulgakov's sticky points concerning pantheism and sophiology from the standpoint of pantheism? Or must we simply say that in some respects he was wrong, or at least that he was trying to articulate something very difficult to express?
Yes, thank you, Father, or brother, I should say. Yes, this is something that I have struggled with, I would say, since I first read Bulgakov. And I am now trying to write about this. And when I read last summer, I was very deep into the writings of Simeon Frank for the first time, because one of my close friends, a blessed memory, Father Peter Scorer, was his grandson. So I now wonder whether it is possible that one can read and understand Bulgakov's teachings is less of a problem, but actually something we can learn from. And one of the ways I've always very much been a Florovskian when it comes to creatio ex nihilo, but I now wonder whether the sort of position that that Florovsky develops, and which Father John, Metropolitan John Zazoulis bases his whole theology on, actually presents more difficulties. And that is to say that creation is somehow, that creatio ex nihilo, God creates something which is totally other, a reality ontologically, which is almost kind of alien from the being of God. Now, if as Orthodox we believe that God is everywhere present and filling all things, that that reality and being as such is something which we can only say that we exist to the extent to which we participate in the divine being, that creaturely being in some sense is then to be understood as participation in the divine being, then perhaps what Bulgakov is talking about the divine and the creaturely Sophias being one reality, and that the creaturely Sophia is in some sense a mode of the divine being, shouldn't be understood as something which just collapses into pantheism, but something which is telling us about God's omnipresence and about his pervasiveness. And so it is utterly impossible, if you take the Florovskian position too far, to really understand some basic teachings. To give you an example, Florovsky argues at the end of his creation and creatureliness or creaturehood, tvare tvarnost, that God actually thinks up the divine ideas of creation. This is something which is totally contrary to patristic teaching. He essentially says that all the divine ideas, or logi, if you want to, of Maximus, that they are eternally, that there are eternally divinely contingent realities in God. he essentially, in order to protect his vision of creatio ex nihilo, he imports temporality into God. So this position is I think, nonsensical and leads to, well, all sorts of theological horrors. And I think it's why he doesn't have a robust interpretation of politics and ethics, is because he doesn't focus on the fact that there are links between the divine being and what is creaturely. So actually, we might be able to learn from sophiology to understand how some sort of vision of creatio ex nihilo must include some vision of creatio ex deo. That is to say that the teaching of Bulgakov in the first part of his Bride of the Lamb on creation out of nothing being somehow in God may not be a contradiction. And in fact, there are people who are arguing this in the reading of Maximus. One of my students is arguing that for Maximus, creatio ex deo and creatio ex nihilo were in a continuity. There were different ways of seeing the same thing. Sorry, that's a technical response, but I actually think that the whole Orthodox tradition pushes towards panentheism. It is the very basis of our liturgical vision of the world. And therefore, we just need to be able to understand in terms of ontology what this means. And so I think that the position of Florovsky actually leads to problems. It's counter to our liturgical vision.
Thank you so much, Dr. Gallaher. I see that for some time now, Dr. Kalatzidis would like to intervene with a comment. So I give the floor to him.
Yeah, thank you very much for giving the floor again, and sorry for this, but I would like to come back a little bit on what Professor Vassiliadis raised as pointers or as question. I think this is a very, very important point when we talk about Bulgakov. Of course, the issue is very controversial and time is running and we are approaching to our time limit. So I don't go on to open up a whole discussion, but just mention something. Brandon, you know the discussion about, you say in your presentation that Bulgakov was not against the fathers. But there,
No,
but there is
absolutely not. No.
Yeah,
no.
but there is a whole discussion on Bulgakov going beyond the fathers. So do you agree with this interpretation, or you think that this is a wrong interpretation? And just one word about what Professor Vassiliadis, my teacher, said about Greek theologians. As I many times highlighted, Greek theology is not influenced by Florovsky. The dominant trend, it is influenced by Losky and his mystical theology, apophaticism, and so on. So personally, I find that Agouridis, who had this kind of Christological concern, etc., was much more close to Florovsky than to Bulgakov. He did not share Bulgakov's concern. He was against any kind of speculation on Trinity. He was any kind of, this kind of, let's say, speculative theology. But this is another discussion. So just a few words, really a few words about Bulgakov going beyond the fathers.
Yeah, I mean, this is an interesting thing. Now, if you mean by going beyond the fathers that somehow you would have a purely biblical type of theology, a theology which is just concerned with seeing what Scripture says, I don't think that that's possible, and it would be not something I would be in favor of, because the fathers, and by the fathers I mean also those who wrote our liturgy. So I would have it as and the whole spiritual tradition of the monks and nuns. This is the common mind of the church where it's embodied, and I don't think now, if you mean by going beyond the fathers, are there certain circumstances in which they simply don't have an answer. Well, that seems to me obvious. That there are many things that the fathers simply could not have foreseen, and I would argue that that we have the words of Florovsky to show that he also agreed with Bulgakov, that there were many instances where in this very limited sense, you had to go beyond the fathers in terms of their literal words. And this is why he emphasized the vision. So I don't know if the fathers can tell us very much about, for example, let's just take one issue to do with liturgy on the internet. You know, there are some very conservative people, and even some people I very much admire, who think it's impious when you have liturgy on the internet or when you film stuff. Well, I don't know where they're getting this from, because certainly the fathers, could they have even conceived? Now, you could come up with some elaborate interpretation involving personalism, but you're not going to be able to find, you know, many things. I would argue that the type of science that the fathers presumed often was wholly incorrect. And so, for example, in some of, if I remember correctly, in some of the kneeling prayers in Pentecost, there's, you know, references to, you know, a type of cosmology that is simply just not the case scientifically. So does that mean that we, in regard to many scientific issues to do with human anthropology, to do with sexuality, must therefore follow the fathers? Well, no. Not if they were working with what appears to be, you know, incorrect scientific views. What we have to understand is their vision to do with the human person. So this is a very tricky thing, and it requires their interpretation creatively of them. Now, I'm not in favor of somehow, I don't know, throwing the baby out with the bathwater and just saying, well, we're going to end up with some sort of Episcopalian version of Orthodoxy, as some conservatives sometimes will accuse me of holding. That's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is that we must be creative when they interpret them. So that would be my understanding of that going beyond the fathers phrase. I don't know if that helps.
Thanks, Brandon.
I should mention, Pantelis, where Bugakov often will differ from Florovsky and Losky is that he will just come out and say, actually, this father got it wrong. People get scandalized when they hear this, but actually it amounts to the same thing as Florovsky and Losky. Florovsky and Losky at certain points will interpret patristic teaching through some sort of, they won't tell you, but through some sort of modern philosophy. And they essentially make the fathers say the modern thing without disagreeing with them. So I've seen this, for example, and I've written an article about this, with Losky's understanding of the essence energies distinction. He actually articulates a lot of palimism in light of, ironically, Bulgakov. So he kind of, as it were, tames the fathers. So this is actually, I think, what we need to understand is they have different ways of interpreting and dealing with the patristic inheritance. Bugakov is a bit more honest in that he will just say, well, actually, this is incomplete. He talks about palimas as an incomplete sophiology. Marcus Plested has so far written the most helpful thing. It's hopefully comes out from OUP that talks about Bulgakov's approach to the fathers and how he reads palimas. And I think that we all need to look at what he says. He is the most balanced person in terms of these issues. And Marcus is most definitely not some sort of radical liberal.
Thank you so much. We have come to the end of this very fruitful webinar. And I'm very sorry. I want to apologize to Dr. Petr Mikhailov from St. Tikhon's University in Moscow that we don't really have more time to address his question. I hope you understand, Doctor. I would like to express my thanks and appreciation to our speaker, Reverend Dr. Gallaher, for his very comprehensive treatment of the work of the two prominent theologians. We are really grateful for the questions that you raised in your paper and the responses you provided in the lecture, but also during the discussion. And we definitely look forward to the forthcoming book on the theological legacy of George Florovsky, but also the one that you are preparing on Sergius Bulgakov. I would like to take this opportunity to thank my colleagues Valila Yannitaki and Panagiotis Theodosiou, who provided...
Yes, for the patience of the translator.
I'll get there. Yes, so special thanks to our interpreter, Paraskevi Arapoglou, for her excellent work. We couldn't have done it without your help. Also, as I said, to the colleagues who provided technical and moral support for this meeting, and to our colleague, Dr. Kostis Drigiannakis, for offering his special photography skills and overall support to the Academy's social media. Lastly, I wish to express a word of thanks to the director of the Volos Academy, Dr. Pantelis Kalatzidis, for this evening's webinar, but also for the series Time for Action as a whole. And I would like to offer my sincere thanks to all participants for their really warm participation. Thank you so much and have a nice evening. I think I would give the floor before we close to Dr. Kalatzidis. Bye from me.
This time I will shift to Greek because there are still some Greek participants, so I would shift to my mother tongue. Θα ήθελα πριν να κλείσουμε αυτή τη σειρά των διαδικτυακών διαλέξεων της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών και εγώ με τη σειρά μου να απευθύνω ευχαριστίες. Θα κάνετε λίγο υπομονή, αλλά πριν απευθύνω ευχαριστίες, επιτρέψτε μου λίγο, ειδικά για σήμερα, να σας πω ότι είχαμε συμμετέχοντες από όλα τα μέρη του κόσμου. Από την Ελλάδα βεβαίως, από τις Ηνωμένες Πολιτείες, από τη Μεγάλη Βρετανία, από την Αυστρία, από τη Γερμανία, από το Λίβανο, από τη Γαλλία, τη Ρωσία, την Ουκρανία, την Ιταλία, τον Καναδά, το Βέλγιο. Θερμές ευχαριστίες σε όλους τους συμμετέχοντες, τόσο από την Ελλάδα όσο και από το εξωτερικό, για την υπομονή τους, για τη συμμετοχή τους και για την προσοχή τους. Τώρα λοιπόν που φτάσαμε στο τέλος αυτής της σειράς των διαλέξεων, των διαδικτυακών διαλέξεων, θα ήθελα να ευχαριστήσω θερμά τον Σεβασμιότατο Μητροπολίτη κύριο Ιγνάτιο για την εμπιστοσύνη με την οποία περιβάλλει το έργο της Ακαδημίας και σε αυτή τη φάση. Να ευχαριστήσω θερμά τον φίλο και συνοδοιπόρο Νικόλα Οσπρούλη, αναπληρωτή διευθυντή της Ακαδημίας Θεολογικών Σπουδών, μαζί με τον οποίο σχεδιάσαμε αυτή τη σειρά των διαλέξεων. Τα ονόματα που ήδη ακούστηκαν, αλλά που οφείλω και εγώ με τη σειρά μου να ευχαριστήσω, τη Βαλίλα Γιαννουτάκη, τον Παναγιώτη Θεοδοσίου και τον Κωστή Ντριγιαννάκη, που ο καθένας από το δικό του πόστο, από τη δική του πλευρά, υποστήριξε αυτή τη σειρά των ηλεκτρονικών διαλέξεων. Την Κατερίνα Πεκρίδου που σήμερα έκανε το συντονισμό, την Παρασκευή Αράπογλου για την πολύτιμη βοήθειά της στη μετάφραση, τον Brandon Gallagher για αυτή την πολύ ωραία, την εξαιρετικά ενδιαφέρουσα εισήγηση που έθεσε πολλά θέματα προς συζήτηση και πιστεύω θα συνεχίσει να θέτει. Και με την υπόσχεση Θεού θέλοντος να ξαναβρεθούμε του χρόνου. Η εμπειρία της πανδημίας μας έμαθε και αυτό το μέσο επικοινωνίας. Η πανδημία είχε και πολλά κακά, αλλά είχε και κάποια θετικά. Μας έδωσε την ευκαιρία ανθρώπους που κατοικούμε σε διαφορετικά μέρη του πλανήτη να μπορούμε να επικοινωνούμε χάρη στην τεχνολογία. Για του χρόνου λοιπόν θα ετοιμάσουμε μια άλλη σειρά διαλέξεων, στην οποία ελπίζουμε θα είστε και πάλι παρόντες. Να είστε όλοι καλά, καλό καλοκαίρι και καλή αντάμωση στα επόμενα. Θερμές ευχαριστίες προς όλους και προς όλες. Να είστε καλά.
Thank you. Have a nice evening.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.